It is my deep conviction that the sooner we end this war, the better, for the people of Ukraine, for the people of the Russian Federation, and those far beyond.
The United Nations Secretary General is in Moscow pushing for a diplomatic solution to the conflict in Ukraine. Can that be achieved? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. Russian President Vladimir Putin is hopeful that talks with Ukraine will yield positive results. On Tuesday, he met with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in Moscow. Guterres was criticized by Ukrainian leaders for going to Russia first. He will visit Kyiv on Thursday. Earlier, Guterres met with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov, who commented on the Ukrainian suggestion of peace talks in the embattled city of Mariupol.
It's a melodramatic gesture. The Ukrainians love to dramatize everything. If we speak about serious work on the negotiations, then they had better reply to our proposals, which have been delivered to their side more than 10 days ago. It turns out even Zelensky did not hear about them.
Now, despite all the diplomatic movement, Andrey Kortunov, the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council and one of the country's top foreign policy analysts, said that we should not expect any breakthroughs. He thinks the situation is not ready for compromise. I spoke with Kortunov earlier and started by asking what he believes Russia's goal in Ukraine is.
Well, there is a officially stated Russian goal of protecting the people of Donbass, and apparently in order to do that, the Russian leadership intends to get full control of the Lugansk and Donetsk regions in their old administrative borders. So that seems to be the prime goal that Mr. Putin has. However, that does not explain some of other military activities that Russia conducts on the territory of Ukraine, namely the occupation of the region of Kherson and some pockets of Russian presence in regions of Kharkiv and Sumy, and also Zaporozhye. So some speculate that probably Putin has more ambitious goals. He would like to secure a land bridge to Crimea, and maybe even a land bridge to Transnistria, a breakaway republic in Moldova. If these are the goals of the Kremlin, that implies that Russia will continue its offensive.
There's been a great deal of speculation here in the Western media that his goals are even greater than that, the Russian president wants to occupy Ukraine in totality, and once he's done that, to go after other former Soviet republics like Georgia, like Moldova, and try and recreate some of what the Soviet Union used to be like. I mean, do you believe, does that have any credence with you at all?
Well, I would say that if these were the goals of President Putin, he would have employed a much larger Russian army. Ukraine is not a small country. There are more than 40 million people living there. In order to occupy the country, in order to control the country, you need to have a much stronger army than what is currently deployed. You probably need, I don't know, I'm not a military expert, but I can imagine that it might require 1 million or 1.5 million strong army, and definitely even these formidable force will confront many problems and many difficulties, including potential guerrilla warfare, including possible terrorist acts and civil disobedience. So it's not a trivial task. I don't know whether President Putin is ready to go for such a goal, but that would require a lot of escalation.
Now, Western nations, NATO nations, they've poured large amounts of weapons into Ukraine to support the Ukrainian fight against the Russians. And we've just had the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, as well as the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, in Kyiv right now. In fact, Lloyd Austin said that the goal of the United States right now is to weaken Russia militarily. Does Russia risk its military being weakened?
Well, any war weakens the military capacity of the country which wages the war. Of course, Russia has a significant military potential, and I think it will take a lot of time and effort to weaken Russia. It can resupply ammunition, it can produce new weapons. It is a pretty formidable defense machine that Putin has created over the last 20 years. So it is not easy to bleed Russia white, so to say. But definitely I can imagine that such a goal might be set by the US administration, and the intention might be to slow the Russian progress in Ukraine to make sure that Russia gets stuck and maybe even to hope for a Ukrainian counteroffensive. So far, if you look at the current developments on the ground, you'll see that Russia is making some progress, but at a relatively low pace. It is advancing in Donbass, but it's just a couple of miles a day, so I don't know at what juncture Russians would decide that enough is enough and they can stop.
Could this conflict have been avoided? I mean, there was and still is a blueprint for compromise. It was Minsk I and Minsk II. It would have given some form of autonomy to the eastern provinces. Ukraine would have declared itself neutral. It would not become a member of NATO. Why do you think those agreements were not implemented?
It's hard to tell because, of course, the Minsk agreements had a long history and a rather sad history. Everybody claimed that they wanted to see the Minsk agreements fully implemented, but probably neither side invested enough into the process of implementing the Minsk agreements. Of course, you know, if you look at the situation from Moscow, or rather from the Kremlin, you will conclude that the responsibility is on the Ukrainian side, that Ukrainians were not consistent, that they were not serious, that it was very difficult to impose on them any commitment to implement the Minsk agreements in full. You go to Kyiv, and of course the picture is quite different. They would accuse the Kremlin of pushing too hard, and of being not sensitive to problems that any European president would encounter if he or she tried to somehow impose the Minsk agreements on the political class and on the Ukrainian population. So I think that both sides would accuse each other and would try to present the failure of Minsk as the sole responsibility of the other side. But I think that in such cases, in such situations, everybody has to take at least a part of responsibility for the failure. And this is very unfortunate because it led us to the situation which, of course, is something that could and should have been avoided.
Andrei, this also goes to another fundamental issue, and that is whether Russia recognizes Ukraine's sovereign right to exist without it entering into Ukraine, without any military intervention from Russia. Is that the situation as far as Moscow is concerned, or does Russia feel that it has to intervene, that it has to determine Ukraine's future?
This is a very good question, and I don't think that I have an ultimate answer to the question, because if you follow the narrative coming from the Kremlin, you can get very mixed signals. On the one hand, they say that there is no intention to have a regime change in Ukraine. There is no intention to occupy Ukraine. But on the other hand, if you follow the statements and the writings of the Russian president, you'll find there that Russians and Ukrainians are essentially the same people. And that the tragedy of Ukraine is that Ukrainians got under some kind of evil spell. And once this spell is broken, all the problems will more or less disappear. So I think that it is really a challenge to the Russian leadership and maybe to the Russian political class to some extent to recognize that Ukraine is a sovereign nation, that Ukraine is different from Russia, that Ukraine has its own destiny and its own right to choose its development trajectory. Once Ukraine is completely recognized as a foreign country, it would be much easier to come to some kind of a settlement.
Does that recognition extend to membership of NATO?
Well, in theory, yes. But of course, I think it would be more natural for Ukraine also to keep in mind the concerns on the Russian side and probably to agree to something less than a full-fledged membership to the North Atlantic Alliance. I think that this issue can be resolved. There is a way to agree on some kind of Ukrainian neutrality, which would include multilateral security guarantees from members, permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, and maybe of also guarantees from neighboring states. I think that right now, Ukraine might be ready to consider a neutral status, provided that all other issues are resolved satisfactorily to Ukraine.
But that would presuppose, of course, a desire on the side of both sides to enter into some kind of negotiations. That doesn't seem to be happening right now. In fact, many people consider the invasion of Ukraine as the start of a new Cold War. But you wrote that these are darker and more dangerous times ahead. Explain that to us.
Well, I think that in certain ways, indeed, it is a more dangerous period than what we experienced during the Cold War, because during the Cold War, especially if you take the later stage of the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the red lines were clear to both sides, and both sides tried really hard not to cross these red lines. It was very clear, for example, that nuclear weapons should not be used under any circumstances. There was also some clarity on what each of the sides could do in the other side backyard. Right now, these red lines do not exist. Moreover, during the Cold War, there was a degree of mutual respect and even mutual trust. The system was static. Right now, the system is very volatile, it is dynamic, and I don't see a lot of mutual trust. I don't see any kind of mutual respect. And of course, that complicates the situation a lot.
If the Russian intention is to block the expansion of NATO eastwards, I'm wondering to what extent has that backfired? Because we now have the prospect of Finland and Sweden joining NATO.
You are preaching to the choir. I have always believed that if you want to stop the NATO enlargement, you should work on the demand side rather than on the supply side. You should work with the countries which have the intention to join NATO, and you should analyze why exactly they want to join NATO. Can you create any alternative means of providing for their security? Can you consider some arrangements that would disincentivize them to join NATO? And of course, if Finland and Sweden join NATO this year, it will be a game changer, especially in the European North. It would create new challenges for Russia. Russia will reciprocate in kind, and the level of stability, security in the north of Europe will plummet. That's clear.
Andrey Kortunov, thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
To continue our discussion on the Ukrainian conflict, let's bring in our panel. From New York, Andrey Dobriansky is head of the UN Affairs at the Ukrainian World Congress. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. And also with us in Washington, D.C., Eugene Chaosovsky is a geopolitical analyst. Welcome to all of you. Andrey Dobriansky, let me start with you. As we've been reporting, there are some efforts underway right now to try and get some kind of a diplomatic solution to this conflict in Ukraine. But one of the key actors in this conflict, the United States, has so far shown no appetite to enter into any kind of talks. We heard President Biden talk about removing President Putin from power, and now we've heard the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, talk about weakening the Russian military, which is putting huge question marks over the United States' intentions in this conflict. In the meantime, of course, Ukraine and Ukrainians are paying a dear price for this. What is your assessment of the situation right now and hopes for some kind of diplomatic solution?
Well, to clarify, what the Secretary of Defense said was the aim of the United States is to weaken Russia so that it does not once again attack another country. And that is what is happening in these meetings in Europe. We saw this coalition that met in Europe this week. Those meetings will happen every month. And that is the international dialogue that is happening. It is that Russia is a pariah state and all the other nations are working together in concert. Now with Germany providing tanks for Ukraine, all nations are coming on board to make sure that Russia is prevented from doing what it has done in Ukraine, which is break international law.
Right, but what about efforts to bring the war to an end?
The war will end when Russia removes itself from Ukraine. In the meantime, it is committing heinous war crimes, including systemic sexual violence across massive areas of Ukraine. It is done purposefully. It is done to eradicate the Ukrainian state, and that is also exemplified by the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian nationals who have been transported across the Russian continent all the way over to the Russian Far East.
Andrei, I get your point about the Ukrainians wanting Russia to leave the country, to leave Ukraine, but wouldn't the starting point for that, wouldn't that be talks?
The starting point would be holding Russia accountable. Russia is on the line here for hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of reconstructing Ukraine. At this point, many cities have been leveled. Severe war crimes, and those reparations will have to be made. There is nothing but a military tribunal in President Putin's future, especially now that he has set his sights on the country of Moldova and its independent aims.
Anton Fedyashin, the Ukrainians have come up with a proposal for peace talks. As we heard earlier on, those talks the Ukrainians want to take place in the embattled city of Mariupol, but Russia has responded to that. Secretary, at least the defense, the foreign minister, Sergey Lavrov, said that this was Ukraine being melodramatic and also claimed that Ukraine had not even responded to proposals that Russia had put forward. But is Ukraine in a tough position here, Anton? Because, I mean, who's calling the shots? Is it Ukraine or Washington?
I think the Ukrainians are calling the shots. It's their nation. It's ultimately their decision. They're supported in their desire to defend their country against this invasion by Washington and other NATO states. But ultimately, this is up to Vladimir Zelensky and the people in his government. The proposal to meet in Mariupol may have been theater, but with a very important meaning, because the city, for all intents and purposes, has been leveled. But from what I understand, the ball in terms of coming, or rather of responding to proposals, is currently in Kyiv's court, because the Russians did submit a list of proposals. And from the best of what everyone's been reporting, including the Ukrainian news, which I follow, the response has not come yet. I'm very pessimistic about these talks, however, wherever they happen, happening before the fate of the Donbas region is settled. I'm afraid that both sides have dug in, and until the battle over the Donbas is finished, whichever way it goes, I don't get any signals from either side that they're willing to actually put the effort and then there's political will to come to the table and seriously take these negotiations to heart and start hammering out a peace solution.
What about the efforts being made by the United Nations, Anton? I mean, the United Nations would be seen by both sides as someone, or an organization that can be trusted.
Yes, true. I did not hear today much talk about specific peace negotiations. So far, Guterres, who of course was in Moscow today, brought specific proposals about humanitarian aid, humanitarian corridors, helping the civilian population, which is devastated by this war. But I didn't hear any constructive statements about a peace solution or bringing the sides to the peace table. The UN has been actually conspicuously sort of absent from this conflict from the past for the past 2 months, which really is an unfortunate reminder that the UN is really a barometer of what happens in the world, but unfortunately not quite the actor, the proponent, the pioneer, the champion of things the way that it had been intended to become in 1945 when the organization was created.
Right, and in fact, the Ukrainians have been very critical of the UN for that very reason. Eugene Tchaikovsky, only a day after the United States said that its intention was to weaken the Russian military, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergey Lavrov, warned that the threat of nuclear war should not be underestimated. Let's listen to what he said.
The risks are very, very significant. I wouldn't want them to be artificially inflated, as many are wishing. The danger of nuclear war is serious, real. It cannot be underestimated.
So, Eugene, what do you make of that? What is the message that Russia is sending here?
So I think that this points to the reality right now. We were talking earlier about negotiations, that the negotiations are happening, but they're largely happening on the battlefield, unfortunately, both in Russia's military operations within Ukraine, but also statements like this about the potential for nuclear war. I don't think Russia would be willing to actually take that threat into action, but it is a reminder that it has that capability, especially if the conventional military operations continue to go south and Russia is not able to meet its objectives. So ultimately, I think that neither side is willing to reach a deal diplomatically at this point because the situation is still quite fluid on the ground. Perhaps once the Donbass operations are over, whether that's in Russia's favor or not, then perhaps Moscow would be more willing to come to a deal. But I think the Ukrainian side has made it clear that they're not going to be, ceding territory or recognizing Russia's hold over Ukrainian territory, whether that's Crimea, Donbass, or other areas that they've gotten more recently. So that makes the negotiations quite difficult at this time, even as they are still happening.
Oh, Eugene, I'm also wondering, why would Russia talk about nuclear weapons when it has said in the past that the only time it would use nuclear weapons was if it faces an existential threat? And it's nowhere near that right now.
Well, that depends, because we've also seen Russian officials, speak out against Western support for Ukraine, especially in terms of the weapons supplies. So the extent to which those will continue and perhaps even increase in terms of heavy weaponry as the focus shifts to Donbass, that will, determine how Russia perceives, such quote unquote existential threats. But yes, as I said before, I don't think it's a realistic option, but one that it likes to remind both the Ukrainians and the West.
Right. Andrey Dobriansky, during a United States Senate hearing, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he said that the United States is now open to the idea of a neutral Ukraine, which would, of course, mean that Ukraine would not be invited to join NATO. How does something like that go down in Kyiv?
What the Secretary of State said was that, first and foremost, no negotiations will happen regarding Ukraine without Ukraine at the table, and also that the United States will respect Ukraine's wishes as far as what they determine their foreign policy to be. What is very clear is that the Constitution of Ukraine sets forth Ukraine's path to become a NATO member, And it has been underscored by the statements of President Zelensky that NATO should be asking Ukraine to join as now the largest combat effective army in all of Europe. So this is not something that is part of the narrative that comes from Russia, explaining that for some reason they would need Ukraine to be neutral, as it was for the first 2 decades of its existence, and yet Russia still attacked it. So while Ukraine gave the greatest gift of peace to the world in ridding itself of all of its nuclear weapons, we see Russia now threatening nuclear conflict on a territory that for once is actually in accord with the rest of the world. And that's why we see over 140 countries at the United Nations keep on supporting Ukraine.
Anton Fedyoshin, there's one other issue about NATO that I want to talk to you about. It was in the Washington Post. An analyst writing in the Washington Post, Henry Olson, he said that despite the show of unity that we are seeing from NATO, it is likely that this conflict will represent, in his words, the alliance's last hurrah. Olson points out that this conflict represents, or points out that West Europe is no longer economically strong as it used to be, and that the nations imposing sanctions on Russia are losing their share of global economic growth. What do you make of that? I mean, will NATO lose its relevance, say, in the next 10 years?
NATO, no, I don't think that NATO will, Anand. I think that the article is really about something a lot broader than that, or at least should be. This is not an issue for NATO. This is an issue for the Western-led world, the very nature of globalization, which is slowly being de-Westernized. And what we're seeing happening in Ukraine is one of the steps in a much longer process of the gradual de-Westernization of global geopolitics, which certainly, by the way, does not mean that this is either the West or NATO's last hurrah. They're not going anywhere. They're going to continue to develop and perform. It's just that there are other powers rising, China first and foremost, but India also, and several others. And so the world is going through tectonic geopolitical and geoeconomic manifestations. And if anything, the behavior of the global South and its attitude towards the war in Ukraine is indicative of the fracturing of the global community of American hegemony, which had really been an overwhelming force in the world for the past 25 years. Mm-hmm. And those days are slowly coming to an end. But a last hurrah, I think that's more of a dramatic flourish. It is part of a long-term process, however.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.